Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Ruby Frankie built a successful YouTube channel called 8 Passengers. She gave parenting advice in a mommy parenting blog format. She started in 2015, got up to 2.5 million subscribers, and Ruby has said she was making millions of dollars doing that. She had over 1 billion views across all of her channel videos. Now, even though she was a mommy blogger giving parenting advice, she has pled guilty to felony child abuse. We're going to talk about that today and about the fact that she is now facing years in prison for that. So, we're going to unpack what on earth happened. So, tonight we're going to be going into 4 parts. The first part, we haven't covered this channel here, this case here on our channel. So I'm going to go into the history of Ruby Frankie and Jodi Hildebrandt. I'm going to talk about what happened, where the charges came from, and then I'm going to cover what happened today in parts 3 and 4. We're going to look at the hearing that happened today where Ruby Frankie pled guilty, and we're going to talk about the guilty plea, what she pled guilty to, and the new details we got in that. And we're going to talk about some of the aftermath for her. What will be the consequences for her? What will she be facing? And I do want to give an advance warning. Some of these details are sad. They're really sad because they do involve child abuse. So I'm going to talk about those because they are factual. They are what happened. She's now admitted to them. They were included in the guilty plea. So I'm going to read that. It's not only factual, but I think it's critically important as part of knowing the truth. And so that's why we're going to talk about that, even though it's not easy. But I give you that warning if that's something that's of particular concern to you and it bothers you. I want to tell you that I'm going to deal with these up front, and we're going to talk about the facts as they are. So let's first start talking about Ruby Frankie. She was a very popular blogger, as you can guess from the stats I gave you a minute ago, but she was controversial at the same time. And that controversy began to grow over time. There were several events where people felt like her parenting was especially harsh. One incident involved her 6-year-old having forgotten her lunch, and she went on and vlogged about that and said, my 6-year-old forgot her lunch and her teacher wants me to bring her lunch, but I'm not going to do that because it's important that my child learn responsibility and learn that the consequence of not remembering to pack your lunch, which she told me she had done, is that you don't get lunch at school. And the teacher will be uncomfortable, but that's the way it is. So that was one of the things that bothered people. They felt like at 6, it was a little harsh, a little young. There was also one blog where she said she was going to make her kids do chores before breakfast, even though they were starving. There was another where she talked about the fact that one of her children had had no bed for a year. Instead, it had a mattress on the floor, apparently. And ultimately, then, her channel was taken down. And there is some confusion about whether it was taken down by YouTube or whether Ruby Frankie just pulled her channel. It's not completely clear, and I've heard both directions. Now, behind the scenes, a lot was going on. Ruby Frankie and her husband were having marital troubles and had gone to counseling with a woman named Jodi Hildebrandt. Now, more on Jodi Hildebrandt in just a minute. Now, according to Ruby's husband, Kevin, he separated from Ruby, moved away from her, and did that at Jodi Hildebrandt's insistence. As part of their counseling, Jodi Hildebrandt said, you must leave. You must separate from the family. You are toxic for them right now. You need to be away from them. And Kevin's attorney says that Kevin did not see his children for an entire year, that he had no idea what we're about to talk about was happening, didn't know that, and that he was trying really hard to obey the rules of staying away from the family as part of working his way back into the family and the marriage to Ruby. Now, let's talk just a minute about Jodi Hildebrandt. Jodi Hildebrandt was a controversial figure, although she had a lot of prestige in her niche and in her area. She was a licensed counselor. Her license has now been frozen, but it's no longer valid, at least not currently. And she was being recommended by the local Mormon bishop to people who were having marital troubles. So she would be recommended. She had founded something called the Connections Classroom. She was doing counseling for couples, for parents. And Ruby, as part of her work and after working with Jodi Hildebrandt, became a mental health coach at Connections. Jodi often recommended that couples stay apart, that they not have any contact as they tried to get back together. For obvious reasons, that's sort of controversial. It's certainly counterintuitive because it's not what you would think people would do. If they want to get back together, you would think they would talk, not ignore each other and be apart. Now, years earlier, her niece, Jessie, had claimed she had been abused by Jessie. Actually, she likes to be called they. They had been abused by Jodi, but there was no consequence to Jodi, and we'll talk more on that coming up. And then everything changed. On August 30th, 2023, there was a 911 call to St. George Communications Center in Idaho, and we are going to hear that 911 call and talk about what happened. So let's go ahead and hear that 911 call. This call came in from a neighbor who lived near Jodi Hildebrandt. And this neighbor is going to call 911 and say that he has in his presence one of the children from one of Ruby's children, but he lives next door to Jodi Hildebrandt, and he's going to tell the police about it.
A 12-year-old boy showed up here at my front door asking for help. And he's said he just came from a neighbor's house, and he's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. He's hungry and he's thirsty. He has duct tape around each ankle. Yeah, there's sores around them. Oh, and he has them around his ankles. I mean, his wrists as well. Okay, this boy has been... This kid has obviously been... I think he's been detained. He's obviously covered in wounds. You know there's been problems at this neighbor's house. I just had a 12-year-old.
So the neighbor calls the police and says that one of Ruby's children, no one knows yet that it's Ruby's child, but that this boy is standing there and he's got all kinds of problems. And he's reporting to the police and actually becomes emotional, tearful as he's telling the police what he's watching, what he's seeing there with this young 12-year-old boy who's hungry and thirsty and has been abused, as he says it. So following that, the dominoes began to fall. The child had run away from Jodi Hildebrandt's house and was arrested and Jodi Hildebrandt was arrested, not the child. Jodi Hildebrandt was arrested. Then it was learned that it was Ruby Frankie's child. Ruby Frankie was arrested. And let's go ahead and see what some of those early charges were against Ruby. I'm going to add to the stage the probable cause. This is the affidavit of probable cause when Ruby was first arrested. And let me switch to there we go. Okay. So in this, Ruby was immediately, the affidavit of probable cause was aggravated child abuse intentionally or knowingly. And that was for both children, because what happened was the little boy came over to the neighbor's house. The police then go to the house to check it out and find Ruby's other young child there. She's just 10 years old. And the two of them had similar conditions. Clearly, the boy was in worse shape, the 12-year-old who had escaped from the house, Jodi's house. But the 10-year-old is back at the house, and they say refused medical treatment for about 4 hours until she finally gave in. Both of them were taken to the hospital. And the severity was felony, a second degree. And I'm going to go ahead and read this again. I'm telling you up front that some of these things are hard. This is not as hard as it's going to get with the new facts that we got. Child abuse. RF, that's the 12-year-old male son of Ruby Franke, climbed out of the window of an Ivins residence belonging to Jodi Hildebrandt and ran to a neighbor's home. RF knocked on the door requesting food and water. The neighbor observed duct tape on RF's ankles and wrists and contacted law enforcement, as he should. Upon arrival, law enforcement observed the wounds and the malnourishment of RF to be severe, and he was transported to the St. George Regional Hospital. RF was placed on a medical hold due to his deep lacerations from being tied up with rope and from his malnourishment. Ruby Franke was seen on a YouTube video filmed in Jodi Hildebrandt's downstairs, which was posted 2 days ago. Now, what's important about that is, and this is the next sentence, this observation adds to Miss Franke, the mother of RF, being present in the home and having knowledge of the abuse, malnourishment, and neglect. Miss Franke requested a lawyer and did not speak with us. With this information and the belief that Miss Franke had knowledge of malnourishment, abuse, and neglect, this charge will be enhanced to a second-degree felony. I ask that Miss Franke not be allowed bail due to the severity of the injuries of her 2 kids located in the home and the fact that DCFS has taken 4 of Miss Franke's children into their custody, and I have yet to speak with 2 of them. The older 2 were never included in any of these charges, so apparently weren't in any way being abused. But these younger 2, as we can see from these charges, were being abused. And so and she's now pled guilty to abuse as well. So what the picture they're describing is they're trying to show that Ruby Franke had knowledge about this, because since the children were not with her, they were apparently in the care of Jodi Hildebrandt. It was important that there be some connection to Ruby. If there wasn't a connection to Ruby, then she can't be charged. It's not relevant. And so they're saying, look, she filmed in this very home 2 days before, just right where the children were. So if she filmed right here, then clearly she knew. After all, malnourishment doesn't happen overnight. That builds over time. And so she must have been aware of that. That's what they're arguing. Then victim EF, 10-year-old female, was found at Jodi Hildebrandt's residence after RF made contact with the police. EF was found to be malnourished and initially, and RF, I believe, is the child, the male child. So after RF made contact with the police, we the police located EF, the 10-year-old. She was found to be malnourished and initially refused medical. After approximately 4 hours, EF agreed Jodi Hildebrandt was found to be in the direct care of Eve Franke. Eve Franke was determined to be malnourished by a medical professional upon arriving at the St. George Regional Hospital. Ruby Franke was seen on a YouTube video filmed in Jodi Hildebrandt's downstairs, which was posted 2 days ago. This observation adds to Miss Franke, the mother of EF, being present in the home and having knowledge of the abuse, malnourishment, and neglect. With this information and the belief that Miss Franke had knowledge of malnourishment, abuse, and neglect, this charge will be enhanced to a second-degree felony. I ask that Miss Franke not be allowed bail due to the severity of the injuries of her due to the severity of the injuries and the fact that DCFS has taken 4, and he repeats that there were 4 children and he hadn't spoken to 2 of them. So at that point, and let me pull out so I can talk to you. So at that point, Ruby Franke was charged with these felony counts, but this part was just the affidavit of probable cause to arrest her. And now I'm going to actually show you the next. I might as well add this to the stage if I'm going to be a small picture, right? Okay. So the next thing that happened was the information was filed. This was 2 days later. And as we walk through, I'm going to show you, because there were some things that she was found guilty of and some charges that were dismissed. And I'm going to show you which are which as we go through. So this was the initial charge, and there were 6 different counts against Ruby Franke. Count 1, they're all aggravated child abuse, but count 1 was for child RF, the boy, and charged intentionally or knowingly inflicted upon a child RF serious physical injury, or having the care or custody of such child caused or permitted another to inflict serious physical injury upon said child, and such serious physical injury includes physical torture. She pled guilty to that. The next count was, again, related to RF, and this one was intentionally or knowingly inflicted upon a child serious physical injury, or having the care or custody of such child caused or permitted another, and I assume that would be Jodi Hildebrandt, to inflict serious physical injury upon said child, and such serious physical injury includes any conduct that results in starvation or failure to thrive or malnutrition that jeopardizes the child's life. Ruby did not plead guilty to that. The state agreed to dismiss that charge against her. The third charge includes conduct toward a child that results in severe emotional harm, severe developmental delay or intellectual disability, or severe impairment of the child's ability to function. Again, it was inflicting the serious physical injury or having the care of the child, doing it herself or allowing someone else to do this, to result in severe emotional harm, developmental delay, intellectual disability, or impairment of the child's ability to function. And Ruby Franke pled guilty to that. There were similar mirror charges related to the daughter, EF. And those charges were starvation, emotional harm, and the one that wasn't directly mirrored, rather than the torture, physical torture, it was simply any, look down at count 6, and I'll show you. It's EF, serious physical injury, or having care or custody of such child caused or permitted another to inflict serious physical injury upon said child, and such serious physical injury includes any combination of 2 or more physical injuries inflicted by the same person, either at the same time or on different occasions. So that was the one difference between the two children. Ruby Franke pled guilty on the emotional harm and the 2 or more physical injuries inflicted by the same person, but the charge, again, related to starvation or failure to thrive or malnutrition, was dismissed. That was dismissed for both children. So I thought you would be interested to see exactly kind of how that played out. So now let's take a look. Let's move forward a little bit and talk about early on. And I'll pull that out and go back to the vid screen. So early on, the focus was on Ruby Franke, and for obvious reasons. She was well known already. She had a very large following on YouTube. People knew who she was. And so although she had started a YouTube channel with Jodi, people barely knew Jodi Hildebrandt. It was a very small channel, nothing of the size that Ruby Franke's had been. And so Ruby Franke, because of the irony of having been someone who dispensed advice on how to parent and now is accused of abusing her own children, that sort of irony led to a lot of focus on Ruby Franke. But it really wasn't long before the focus of the actual investigation, or at least what we could see of it, seemed to shift from Ruby to Jodi Hildebrandt. And there was a lot of reason for that, because it was not the first time that accusations had been levied against her. And so for that reason, she may have been seen as the target that really needed to be taken down to avoid harm to other people. And so that's going to play into what we're going to see about what happens with Ruby's plea of guilty. Now, there were several different people. Again, I mentioned the niece, Jessie, and the niece, Jessie, gave an interview to KUTV2, News Salt City News, Salt Lake City in Utah, to Brian Schnee, who has done an amazing job covering this entire issue. He's interviewed lots of people, and one of the best interviews, I think, was of the niece Jessie. And they have been left in Jodi Hildebrandt's care as a teenager for an entire year, and had really disturbing things to say about their care during the period of time with Jodi Hildebrandt. So this is, and listen to what she said as part of the interview. I'm going to link the whole interview below. It was super interesting. So I think you would really enjoy watching it. But this is what Jessie had to say. Just a little short clip of it.
It's been a really interesting experience watching everyone focus on Ruby, and I understand why, but this is Jodi. These are Jodi's words. These are Jodi's ideas. These are over decades old. So yeah.
Is that why you've called Jodi the mastermind behind all of this?
Yes. That doesn't excuse Ruby's involvement and her perpetuating these beliefs and these systems, but Ruby didn't come up with this. Ruby obviously supports it and has used these on her children.
I thought this was such a nuanced and well done interview, such an intelligent description of it. But Jessie describes their own abuse and says, this is what happened to me when I was in Jodi Hildebrandt's care. And it is shockingly similar. So I wanted to play that little clip for you. So first, she's telling us that this is really Jodi. This isn't Ruby. It's not that Ruby didn't do this and shouldn't be held guilty or shouldn't be found guilty of this, but it's that the place where this thinking is coming from is not Ruby, it's Jodi. And here's what happened in the past. So this is more of the same.
But this is coming from Jodi.
In short, can you describe what you mean? Like, which practices are you talking about?
Sure, yeah. So the things that I experienced while living with Jodi, I experienced being tied, I experienced being duct taped, I experienced being blindfolded, I experienced severe isolation, I experienced severe emotional, spiritual, and psychological abuse. I experienced the being told I shouldn't be around other people, being told that I was dangerous to be around.
Just unbelievably disturbing, frankly. I really am grateful that Jessie came forward, because I think that information is so important, because it shows why it was so critical that the state do whatever it took to make sure that it could properly find whether or not Jodi Hildebrandt was guilty. And so I think that's ultimately what they've done. Now, Jessie was not the only person who came forward to talk about what had happened with Jodi Hildebrandt. Another man, for example, Adam Steed, had been a former patient client of Jodi Hildebrandt and had made complaints to the Utah Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing that ultimately resulted in an 18-month probation for Jodi Hildebrandt for unprofessional conduct. He said that she had made false claims about him to church, and he lost privileges at his Mormon church, that he was temporarily suspended from Brigham Young University, and even got divorced, all because, he said, of Jodi Hildebrandt. There was also, and let me add this to the stage, an NBC News article where Adam Paul Steed said that Hildebrandt had made false claims about him to the church, BYU, and his ex-wife. He had lost church privileges, was temporarily suspended, and got divorced. And he said all of that came directly from what Jodi Hildebrandt was doing in her, quote, counseling. There were other people as well. So we got the word yesterday that it looked like there was going to be a plea deal for Ruby Franke when she appeared for her hearing today. And that's in fact what we got. I want to watch it together. It's about 5 minutes, and I want you to see what happened. It's pretty short. We'll just talk through it. Although I think you'll be able to clearly understand it, but we'll talk about it as we go. I have, as usual, cut down.
Ms. Frankie is now here.
I think she's smiling at family.
Mr.
That was my
Winward, we
guess.
are scheduled for a waiver hearing. Is there going to be a waiver today?
There will, plus a plea agreement, Your Honor.
All right.
All right.
So there's a waiver of both the preliminary hearing that otherwise might have been scheduled and also
Bailiff
a
hand
guilty
has
plea.
been executed.
Already signed.
All right. Mr. Winward, you have discussed with Ms. Frankie a preliminary hearing, what's involved in a preliminary hearing. She understands she has a right to a preliminary hearing on all of the charges in the case. She understands what the charges are, and she's prepared to waive a preliminary hearing in the case on all charges.
She is, and that is contained in this agreement on page 7 as well.
Very good. All right. I've been handed a plea agreement, and it appears to be signed by Ms. Frankie. Ms. Frankie, did you sign this agreement?
Yes,
And you did that today? When did you sign it?
on the 18th,
Okay. You've read it carefully?
every word.
Your signature represents to the court that you've read it carefully, that you understand what you've read, and that you agree to all of the terms. Is that all accurate?
Yes,
You've had sufficient time to ask questions of your counsel, to go over any questions you have. You're ready to go forward.
yes,
You don't need any more time.
I'm ready.
Ms. Frankie, is anyone pressuring you to enter into this agreement?
No,
Anyone promising you anything I haven't been told about?
no,
Anything that's not in the written plea agreement?
no,
Are you under the influence of alcohol or drugs today?
no,
Is there anything today that could in any way interfere with your ability to understand the agreement, its consequences, anything?
no,
No physical.
So the judge is just setting up to make sure that there couldn't be any argument later that, oh, I couldn't possibly have understood what I was signing, what I was entering into because I had been drinking, I had taken drugs. All of that's pretty unlikely. She's been brought over directly from the prison, as you can see, from the jail, I should say, as you can see. Nonetheless, just to make sure that it's solid, he goes through all of that.
Condition, no medication, nothing.
no,
Any further record, counsel?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Winward, we ready to proceed?
We are ready to proceed.
All right, then. Ms. Frankie, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
guilty,
To count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
guilty,
To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
guilty,
And to count 6, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
with my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children, guilty,
There is a factual basis set forth in the agreement that is a stipulated factual basis, counsel.
That's correct, Your Honor. That is correct, Judge Walton.
The court finds that the factual basis is sufficient. All of the terms of the agreement are stipulated, including that the court obtain a pre-sentence investigation report, correct?
Correct.
There won't be any argument about whether prison is the appropriate sentence, and there's an agreement about the 4 counts running consecutive.
That is correct.
Now, that was a bit of a surprise right there. They agreed that the 4 counts she pled guilty to would run consecutively. You normally would have expected her to at least argue, especially on a plea deal, to try to get some kind of agreement that they would all be run concurrently. So when she served one, she was serving all of them and they would end at the same time. But she agreed instead that they would run consecutively. And so you're going to see the judge then have a little bit of a discussion about that, or discussion about something, but I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't what the topic was. Thank you, Marlon. I appreciate it.
All right. The court finds then that Ms. Frankie's pleas are made knowingly and voluntarily. The court therefore accepts and enters those pleas. The court orders the preparation of a pre-sentence investigation report to be prepared by AP&P and the Department of Corrections. Counsel, what about sentencing on February 20th? I think, do you and your client agree to waive time, counsel?
We do agree to waive time, Your Honor.
February 20th, I believe, is a Tuesday. Is that right? – 10 a.m.?
That works for us, Your Honor.
All right. Anything else for today?
Your Honor, maybe, I've heard the court say this several times in a different fashion. We are not binding the court to any specific sentence, and the court retains its right to sentence as it sees fit. I just mentioned that this is not a Rule 11 plea, but although it's a stipulated statement of defendant.
Counsel, approach, please.
I don't know why he
Anything else for
mentioned that.
today?
No, Judge. Nothing from the state.
I
Thank you, Your
cut
Honor.
they had a
you.
little
We are in
longer
recess.
discussion.
Thanks, Your Honor.
And then And that's it. I mean, if you can even imagine, in 5 minutes, her life completely changed. Now, you could argue it didn't take 5 minutes. It took what she did to cause her life to change. But with that 5 minutes, everything was over. There was a guilty plea. There will be no appeal. There will be no jury trial. There will be, and the lawyer even reminded the judge, and this will be consecutive, and you get to decide. We haven't agreed on any number. I'm not sure why he mentioned that again. And it was right when he did that the judge called everybody up. So I don't know what the discussion was. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall so I could have heard what they were talking about, but we didn't get to hear that. So I also want to show you then, because they filed it today, I want to show you what the actual plea deal was. Let's go to that. So the plea deal, because we got a lot more details in that, and there's going to be some hard details in here. So I'm just going to tell you up front that that's the case, that there were some hard details here. Now we see that for each of the counts, she pled guilty to counts 1, I believe it was 3, 5, and 6. Yeah. And for each one, she faces 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison and a fine in the amount of $10,000 plus a 90% surcharge plus a $50 court security fee. Now, I think the money will be less of an issue for her given the earnings that came from her YouTube channel, but 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. That's for count 1. That is for count 3. That is for count 5. And that is for count 6. And remember, the lawyer was extremely clear. Both of them were extremely clear that this was a situation where they would run consecutively. So given that she's pled guilty to 4, it looks to me like the absolute minimum amount of time she could serve would be 4 years in state prison. The maximum would be 60 years, 4 times 15 years, 4 counts, 15 years, 60 years. So the judge is being asked to sentence her to something between 4 and 60 years, and complete discretion has been given to the judge. They are not presenting him with a number saying, we have all agreed to this, or the prosecution has agreed to whatever. It could well be that based on her cooperation later, there will be some kind of agreement. And at that point, they will all agree and the prosecution will present a suggestion, a number, an agreement. But at this stage is completely open. And the sentencing is to be February 20th. That's prior to the time I would think that Jodi Hildebrandt could possibly have been tried. So let's take a look at some of the specific details that we got in this plea agreement where she pled guilty. From approximately May 22nd, 2023 until August 30th, 2023, in Washington County, Utah, the defendant, Ruby Franke, intentionally or knowingly inflicted and allowed another adult to inflict serious physical injuries upon her children that were ages 9 and 11 to 12, as more fully described below. Count 1. The defendant's actions involved the physical torture of RF. Initially, RF was forced to do physical tasks for hours and days at a time. These included wall sits, carrying boxes full of books up and down stairs, and working outside. Eventually, RF was forced to do outside labor without shoes and in the summer heat. He was forced to stand in the direct sunlight for several days. He was forced to remain outside at all hours of the day and night for extended periods of time. These actions resulted in repeated and serious sunburns with blistered and sloughing skin. RF was denied adequate water for several of the days. He was required to remain in the summer heat, and he was punished when he secretly consumed water. He was denied sufficient food, and when given food, he was given very plain meals, e.g. rice and chicken, while others in the house ate regular and more flavorful meals. He was isolated from other people and denied all forms of entertainment, including books, notebooks, and electronics. Now, on that last one, being denied entertainment, I'm not sure I would count that. But the rest of it, this is his mother pleading guilty to this, his mother pleading guilty to intentionally and knowing that these things were occurring. In addition, after RF attempted to run away in July, his hands and feet were regularly bound. Binding included being tied to the defendant, I guess to Ruby, and to weights. Many times the binding included using 2 sets of handcuffs, one on RF's wrists and one on his ankles. At times, with RF lying on his stomach, ropes were used to tie the 2 sets of handcuffs together so that his arms and lower legs were lifted off the ground. The bindings resulted in injuries to RF's wrists and ankles where the handcuffs, this is hard to even read. I mean, this is terrible, cut through the skin and damaged the muscle tissue. These injuries were treated with homeopathic remedies and covered with duct tape. Then the bindings were placed on top of the duct tape. Truly astonishing. Specific instances of abuse committed by the defendant include kicking RF while wearing boots. Ruby did that? Holding his head underwater and cutting off oxygen by placing her hands over his mouth and nose. Count 2, and if this was all Ruby, what did Jodi do? Count 2, the actions described above caused severe emotion harm to RF due to the fact that they began in May and escalated throughout the summer months. Okay, sorry. I was momentarily distracted. Thank you, Iris McClass. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Additionally, the defendant and another adult regularly sought to indoctrinate RF and convince him that he was evil and possessed, and that he needed to willingly be obedient to avoid punishments, and that the punishments were necessary to repent. He was also told that everything that was being done to him were acts of love. And if you listen to the entire interview that I told you about of Jessie, the niece, that was similar. And I listened to a number of interviews, so I can't say for sure which ones were the ones where Jessie talked about that, but talked about similar sorts of things. Count 3, the defendant's actions also caused severe emotional harm to EF. Other than binding and the specific instances of abuse RF was subjected to, EF was subjected to the same treatment as her brother. She was isolated and forced to do the physical tasks, remain outside, and denied food and water. She was also repeatedly told she was evil and possessed. The punishments were necessary for her to be obedient and to repent, and these things were being done to her in order to help her. EF was convinced that she was evil and needed to go through these things in order to repent. Count 4, the defendant's actions caused 2 or more physical injuries to EF. She was forced to work outside in the heat, barefoot. She was also forced to run barefoot on dirt roads for an extended period of time. EF's feet were repeatedly injured by, and she was repeatedly sunburned. When examined on August 30, these wounds were apparent by scabs, blisters, and sloughing skin. Trying to remember if there's anything else. I wanted. So, and now we go through what Ruby Franke has agreed to. She agreed to plead guilty to all of those things. That what I read to you, she's actually admitting that she did and pleading guilty to that. I mean, let that sink in for a minute. She is pleading guilty to doing those things, knowingly, intentionally doing those things. All of those were aggravated child abuse. The state agreed to dismiss the 2 that I mentioned to you earlier that related to starvation and lack of food. The defendant shall submit to a pre-sentence investigation with adult probation and parole. The defendant agrees to serve a prison term. The sentence received for count 1, 3, 5, and 6 are to be served consecutive to each other. So 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is the minimum. And then after that, it could be up to 15 per, just like we talked about. The defendant agrees to testify truthfully against Jodi Hildebrandt, and in return, the Washington County Attorney's Office agrees to remain neutral regarding future hearings before the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. So I think that was all I had. Yeah. And so this was all signed. It was signed by Ruby. It was signed by the prosecutor. It was signed by her attorney. And then that was entered today. And that is the guilty plea. Let me pull out of this and we can talk a little bit more. And I want to say that thanks again. I really appreciate Irish is saying that she enjoys the podcast. I'm sure I really appreciate, and I love having y'all watch these. I have steered away mostly from the cases that involved children. Lori Vallow Daybell was an exception, and I think primarily because of the fact that so few details were released. I think maybe had I known in advance, maybe I wouldn't have covered it, but that case was unbelievably important and interesting. This case, I think the saving grace is that these 2 children lived, and they are, I don't know where they are now, but I sure am. I'm certain they're happier than they were. I'm certain they're in better positions than they were. But it is hard to listen to. It is hard to hear what a mother is admitting that she did. And you saw her react each time she said those things. It seemed a little dramatic. I'd actually be interested in what your reaction was, what your thoughts were to the way she reacted. Each time she leaned back and closed her eyes as she said guilty. But I don't know. They did. So I'll tell you some of the things I think she got out of it. And then I'll also tell you what the state, in my view, what the state got out of it. For her, she got, and go ahead and be writing your questions in because I'm nearing the end. And if you write question marks at the beginning, it'll help me to spot them. So 2 charges were dropped, and they were probably the charges that were of greatest concern to her, the idea that she wasn't feeding her children. Although, as you could see in what I read, there were some comments about that she pled guilty to, like the kids being out all day with no water and that sort of thing. The sentencing also is a range. So probably Ruby Franke is really hoping that her cooperation, that her willingness to come forward will encourage the judge to go with a lower number. And so that the judge will be more likely to say something closer to 4 than something closer to 60. Had she made no plea deal and gotten convicted on all, it could have been as high as 90 years. 6 times 15 would have been a possible number. So maybe she figures this is her best bet to keep it lower. She also might think that she has no realistic way to get off on these charges, that it's going to happen. So she might as well get the best deal she can out of it by looking cooperative. And she does get the opportunity to avoid a public trial. That would have been embarrassing. It would have been covered in great detail by the media, obviously. Her children, though, I don't think will be spared having to testify necessarily, because their testimony will be relevant against Jodi Hildebrandt. So unless Jodi Hildebrandt testifies, they still will have to testify, but at least they won't have to testify against their mother because she's reached this agreement. And I can't even imagine what that could have been like. The consecutive that she agreed to, that surprises me because it's automatically makes the sentence worse by a lot, by fourfold, if you will. I'm surprised that was just an agreement because the judge might have said, well, I'll let 2 of these run concurrently. You know, you don't really know, but maybe the judge will bake that into his decision when he decides how many years to give on each individual count. So now why would the state do this? I think it was a no-brainer deal for the state. I think the state clearly got something. It gave up very little. She would have gotten, she even now can get up to 60 years and because they're consecutive. So the best at trial would have been 90 years. So not a huge difference, especially at Ruby Frankie's age. And they got 4 to 60 without a trial. That's much easier for the state, and it's a guaranteed guilty plea conviction. I think, too, the state sees how incredibly important it is to go after Jodi Hildebrandt. I think they have seen her as the more valuable target. And by that, what I mean is it is critically important, the state believes, to keep her from ever doing this again. Ruby Frankie only has so many children. She's never done this to anyone else's children. And so they may feel like we're safe. We're safe with Ruby Frankie. But Jodi Hildebrandt, on the other hand, was a counselor, and we need to make sure that she doesn't go out and continue to influence parents or people to do things like this to children. And so that may be what the state is thinking, and it's worth it to them to get Ruby's cooperation against Jodi Hildebrandt. Sentencing, as you heard them talk about, is going to be on February 20th for Ruby Frankie. So let me go real quickly. First of all, I want to say thank you again to Marlon and to Irish, my class. I really appreciate the super chats from both of you. Thank you. And let's go and see if there are some questions over here. Mary Cat wants to know, are there special considerations when kids testify, like video or empty courtroom or something to make it less awful? Yes. Usually there are. A lot of times they might take everybody out, just be the judge, the court reporter, and maybe the attorney. Sometimes the attorneys are really hamstrung on whether or not they can ask questions. There may be a whole lot of different rules and restrictions that the judge could put in so that the child doesn't have to testify, because nobody really wants, I mean, hopefully no one wants the kids to have to testify, and no one wants the kids to be traumatized more, at least hopefully not. And for sure, the judge and the prosecution don't want that. And so there will be a lot of parameters set around that. And we saw that in one of the recent trials where the camera was normally allowed to look at the witness. The camera was not allowed to look at to focus on or show the witness, although we then heard the witness testify. I forgot which case that was, but that was a teenager, an older teenager. So for these kids, there might be even more restrictions than that because of their age. By the time trial comes around for Jodi Hildebrandt, they'll be older, but nonetheless, they're still pretty young. They'd be at best in their early teens. Let's see what else we have. I'm looking for the question marks at the beginning. Jerry Michael's asking me, do you think the kids played a role in why she took a plea so they wouldn't testify? I like to think so, because certainly that would be worth it to just about any parent, I would think, to not have your kids go through that. I like to think that that was something that she thought about and that was important to her. So I'll just leave it at that. As far as I know, that is the case. All right. Jersey Jen wants to know, where are the minor kids? I think those are now her 2 youngest, Jersey. I think that's what you're asking me. There were 2 older teens who were with another, she sent with another woman, and that's where the police picked them up. And then there were 2 who were out of the house. So those were their 6 children. And I think these are the 2 youngest ones. I think that's what Jersey is asking me. And Lorraine wants to ask me, who are these 2 girls to each other? I'm not sure what you mean, Lorraine. I'm not sure what there were. I'm not sure what you mean about the two girls. There was a son and a daughter who were both the subject of these complaints related to Ruby Franke. And Justice Jane wants to know, do you think Frankie can testify with the prosecution in Jodi's trial if she has one? I think she can, and I think she's agreed to do that. I think she specifically agreed to do that in her guilty plea. And I'll take one more question. Okay, I see two more questions. Okay, and Lee is asking me, will Dad have any real chance at custody? I don't know. I've been wondering about that too. It's been a while since we've heard anything about that. And a lot of it, they put that all under seal. So nobody is, after there was a pretty big and important leak about something that Ruby said related to one of her children, that frankly sounds a lot like what Jessie, the niece, said. Then after that leak, they put that all under seal and we haven't really heard anything about it. So does the dad have a real chance? I don't know. It really will depend on the fact finding. What does the judge think about his statement that he had no idea that this was going on, and that but also that he had not seen the kids for an entire year and he thought that was in everybody's best interest. It's just really strange set of circumstances. I do think Ruby's plea probably protects him to some degree. And Drew P is asking me whether a kidnapping charge could be levied upon the parents, even though the children are theirs biologically. I think it could be. I don't think in this case that she had taken the children anywhere. So I don't think that that would be something that Ruby Franke could be charged with. In general, though, you do get that when you have a biological parent. A lot of times those Amber alerts that you get sounding on your phone, those relate to a biological parent who took a child and didn't have the right to have custody of the child. I mean, not always, obviously, but sometimes. So I want to say we're about to do a really special outro. This is our fourth outro on the special emojis. We are ever so slowly, and that's entirely my fault, moving toward having memberships here on the channel. And Marlon has been making a set of emojis for us. They're going to be part of the perk. So when you join and become a member of the channel, which will happen really soon, I promise, then you will have the chance to have these special emojis and to use them in the chat. I think it'll be really fun. And he has just done an amazing job. These are really fun. I think everybody will love using them, and it'll make the chat even more fun than it is now. And it's a pretty darn awesome chat, if I have to say so. So I want to thank Marlon and Mama Pinks, who faithfully help us with the chat and make it a pleasant, happy place to come to. And I want to thank all of you because you make it so nice too. People are polite and kind. They have opinions, which I would fully expect, but they say them nicely. And I really appreciate that and admire you all for that. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's see Marlon's latest emoji. I haven't seen this one yet either.